My advice
My
for the
advice
next
for the next
president.
president.
Next president of the
My
United
advice
States.
to the next president of the United States.
My advice to the next president of the United States is to urgently reform the tax system and the tax code. If we look over the last several years since the financial crisis, the level of capital investment by public companies in the US has increased very modestly relative to, say, earnings or operating cash flows. If we could somehow stimulate those capital expenditures, it would really help to increase economic growth. If we look at the balance sheets, especially of the largest public companies in the US, there's an enormous amount of cash being held on those balance sheets. I think it's around $1.3, $1.4 trillion of cash held by US multinationals is held outside of the US. Why is that? Well, it's because the US tax code has this unusual feature under which the earnings, taxable income of the foreign subsidiaries of these US multinational companies is taxed not only in the foreign jurisdiction, the foreign country where those earnings are actually made, but also by the US. So for example, if Apple earns $100 outside the US in a country with a tax rate of 20%, the incremental 15% to bring it up to the US tax rate of 35% is going to be taxed by the US. If that cash, those earnings, are held in the foreign subsidiary outside the US, they're not going to be subject to US taxes. So that additional 15% is only going to be payable if that cash is returned to the US by Apple or by one of these other multinationals. So the problem is really twofold. One, the US tax rate is relatively high compared to most developed countries. And number two, we have this relatively unusual feature of the US tax code in which the cash held offshore is going to be tax-free, at least to the US tax rate, as long as it's held offshore. If we could reform the tax system to remove those things, then this money would very likely flow back into the US, would be spent by these companies, and could very well trigger a very substantial increase in capital investment and potentially lead to much stronger economic growth in the US. And so it's very perverse if we think about the fact that these companies would like to operate in the US, but are using this strange feature of the tax code to essentially take themselves offshore outside the US to avoid these high taxes. Those jobs, the investment, everything else potentially is leaving the US.